as we go through this, it's not going to be a very detailed technical description, but really just to give you awareness of a lot of different issues. And kind of keep in mind, at least because it's different in Louisiana and it's different in New York, the regs are different, but within the context of California, think about what the regs are, you know, what the technical reality of what happens in a disaster, and point out some of the examples to think about. What the overriding concern is for health and safety, or is it legal, or is it law enforcement, is it evidence collecting, or is it just moving the debris out, and some of the political realities dealing with disaster debris. First thing I'd like to go over is some of the materials itself that occurs when you have a disaster. And these materials, we would think of them as a LEA as solid waste, but these materials are actually very, very different, and the same material can have different properties depending on the kind of event it is and the amount that you have, and it's varied according to the proximity to the event, like how close to the breach of the levee is the material, where the waste was generated, how long did the material sit there. We're going to talk a little bit about hazardous waste, special waste, and something that's kind of always left out is motor vehicles that you have when these events happen. And a lot of times when we look at regs, when we have special circumstances, when a disaster happens, a lot of the definitions don't fit, or you might have to change the definitions just to be able to get something permitted. So let's take a look basically at the World Trade Center 9/11. Most of the materials that are there are resulting from collapse of high-rise buildings, so it's like concrete, glass, and steel. For Hurricane Katrina, it's residential and low-rise buildings, which is mostly wood frame construction, drywall, plaster, some brick buildings. In Katrina, there's a lot of green waste, or yard waste, and again, motor vehicles. So I'll give you some pictures to look at. This is from 9/11, and you can see that it's very localized. It's confined to a small block here, relatively speaking. And most of the material here is, like I said, glass, steel, and concrete. That's the steel exoskeleton from the building that you see. And because this is a kind of in a small area, it really limits what you can do with this stuff. And so the primary goal here was just to get this off-site. But you had the complicating special circumstance that this was also a crime scene. So law enforcement was intimately involved. So as an LEA, you're thinking and during your planning, what's your relationship with law enforcement? Have you discussed this before? Do you have procedures worked out? So these are all the issues you should be thinking about. This is kind of the underground part of the 9/11, where you actually got into the subways and the parking lots. And remember, like I said, this is really a crime scene, and the goal was to get this stuff off and staged and processed. But do we do this as solid waste, or is this done as evidence? Okay. Contrast Katrina. The thing that you see in the center, the dark thing, that's actually a two-story cargo barge. And the force of the hurricane was so great, it actually took this barge and just shoved it right through the levee. So this is actually where the levee broke. So you can see that where the proximity where the levee broke, there isn't really any standing houses. Everything is just wiped flat, and only kind of disaster debris, if we talk about materials, is really just the heavier materials like concrete and blocks and stuff like that. Very little wood and stuff. And you see some vehicles. Again, this is where the levee broke, and you see really this is an entire residential area. There's really no standing homes here anymore. And you can look at the force of the flood basically destroyed these vehicles. And one of the things that you can see in this next slide is you can actually tell which way the water actually flowed. So you can, from your standpoint, it's from right to left. So you can see the houses just being floated away and shoved against each other. So the houses on the right are actually much more damaged than the houses on the left. And when we talk about proximity to the center where the break in the levee was, you can tell, and this is actually in the middle of a street, a highway, and the houses just literally got floated into the highway. And so when we talk about solid waste, how do you start recovering? How do you collect all those materials? Well, just depending upon how far you are from the epicenter, you can tell from this next slide While the houses on the right, there's not really much salvaging or deconstruction or recycling that you're going to be able to do. It's just too dangerous to go in those. But as you get further away from the forest, you'll see the houses are standing. So those you can actually maybe try to salvage some materials. So a lot of the times when you look at this, the issues are, well, what's the best way in terms of collection? How do you, and everything has to be at the filter of health and safety. But is it actually able, can you actually go in this house safely to even make an assessment of what can be recovered? Looking at some of the definitions, the state, of course, in Louisiana, they had broad definitions of demolition waste. But does that definition, does it work for a disaster? Does it work for setting up temporary, or what they call temporary staging and processing sites that really are kind of turning into landfills, but shouldn't be, but they're calling them temporary because they eventually plan to move them. And because they really hadn't thought the disasters out very well, they probably have I'd say probably over 100 of these huge staging areas all over the city. And it's complicated by the fact that there's an infestation of termites, and the material is quarantined, so you can't ship it out of a certain radius. They actually drew a line around the area and says that's as far as it can go. Of course, there's hazardous materials, asbestos, e-waste, lots of infectious waste, special considerations. Well, infectious waste actually comes from human remains, lots of animals, which wasn't really thought about during the planning stage. All the food waste from the refrigerators, and what do you do with the valuables that are still there that people abandoned? The food waste was kind of interesting because they have a contractor just to deal with the thousands and thousands of refrigerators that got put aside at these landfills. They have a contractor going through just removing food waste and having to deal with food waste. And actually, I had a lot of pictures that I actually can't show people because it's just, it's actually not very fun. This is actually, if you look at these houses that actually was near the breach, you'll see that little red mark on next to the door. When it's red and it's in the shape of a human, that means there's still human remains inside, and they need to get that out. So that actually takes priority over a lot of different things. This is a little bit further away, and you'll see they've actually painted with a spray can on the building. It says "1 dog dead." So they even had marked out the spots where all the animals had died, and then a contractor comes by and picks them all up. This is actually what they call, at least for this disaster, they call this demolition debris. So the closest thing I can think of in California is this is like construction and demolition waste. But I think in California, this would never make it as construction and demolition waste. This is actually tennis shoes, it's basically stuff from people's closets. And as you drove through the city, this is just stacked like windrolls on the sidewalks throughout the whole city. And this is the stuff that's being processed as demolition waste, or what we'll look at as kind of inert waste. But take a look at this. This is really not really construction or demolition waste. Then the other thing that has to be dealt with is really the motor vehicles. Okay. This was near the epicenter, so you can tell what a flood actually did to this car. You actually just flung it around so much, and it just basically got beaten into a pulp. But if you look at this, you have to understand, okay, this is solid waste. It's polymetal. It's it's recyclable. But we had this issue of the fluids. So they actually had a contractor go out and pick up the thousands and thousands of cars just to consolidate them. And this is just one of the sites I drove by, and they have huge number of these sites. And this is probably over 100 acres of cars stacked 4 or 5 high. So just think about how many cars that is. And then they have a contractor that goes by that actually drains all the fluids before it's picked up and brought to this facility. They still don't know what they're going to be doing with all this stuff. It's just state collecting and staging and trying to remove the hazardous fluids out of it right now. And for 9/11, there was, underneath the building, you had the parking garages. So these are like all the cars that came out of the 9/11. Again, fluids had to be drained, and this material and the vehicles were staged and then sent off to recycling. Like I said, vehicles is, you need to plan for that if these are the kind of disasters that you're going to be expecting. So this is asbestos, separate, and again, a separate contractor for asbestos. because before they started demolishing the buildings, they needed to get the asbestos of what they can get to safely, get it out. But the buildings that was not safe to get into, the asbestos is basically not even removed. These are just little side issues depending on how your jurisdiction or how your city is set up, different kinds of ways that you're going to get. For 9/11, they actually tried to recover the subway trains, the rail cars. And during disasters, actually in New Orleans, the collection system actually broke down. So basically all these homes are abandoned, but some people actually went back, and FEMA had given some of these people trailers. But these abandoned homes really have no trash collection, so that's another issue that has to be addressed. And what they try to do is the sewage system is actually hooked back up into the temporarily into the home's sewage system. One of the things that's really interesting is I put this under the broad umbrella of special circumstances. There are always issues that come up that complicate things. For 9/11, it basically was a crime scene. And within the crime scene, you also, within those buildings, you had a lot of federal agencies, so there were a lot of very sensitive documents. And that involved a complete different approach to how disaster debris was collected, staged, and processed. Now, I'll have some slides for you on that. For Hurricane Katrina, it wasn't so much a crime scene, but you had waterlogged, damaged materials, and very, very complicated by the fact that I mentioned that it had the Formosan termite. So you had to figure out all your collection and disposal and recycling options within the context of the quarantine limits. So for 9/11, some of the special circumstance of being a crime scene gave rise to the fact that huge amounts of law enforcement was involved. So there were literally meetings every single day, morning and at the end of the day, coordination with the NYPD and the FBI. Extra security, there was a whole contractor that did nothing but security and badging procedures. And in certain areas, in terms of the first cut at processing or staging the materials that were recovered from the 9/11 site, the World Trade Center site, all the personnel were law enforcement. Okay? And those were all in secure, staged areas. Okay? And the primary goal was to retrieve human remains, recover sensitive documents, and really gather crime scene evidence. This is where all the materials were taken to the Fresh Kills landfill and put here. And here, just the first, put everything here, the small pieces, the large pieces, the steel, everything that was staged at the landfill. The first screen, it was literally the bigger pieces were removed and checked, and everything that was physically manageable by people was basically sorted through. This is all law enforcement. This is all NYPD and FBI going through and sorting. And in New York, the weather gets pretty bad, so they actually had set up temporary rigid tent buildings to enable this process to go on 24 hours a day. And the smaller pieces, you can see how small these pieces are. Literally, every piece of material that basically got disposed or recycled had gone through basically like a MRF's processing plant going through sort belts and was inspected by law enforcement. And they had set up many, many different lines, or basically like MRF buildings, where all this inspection took place. And if the weather was okay, they did it outdoors. And you can literally see on the sort line how small the pieces are. So you're talking down to pebbles. Everything had gone through a sort line. And literally, from a regulatory standpoint, the police didn't even release this material to become to be handled by the solid waste group until it had been processed as evidence. A little bit about landfill disposal capacity. At least in New York, they had to reopen the Staten Island or the Fresh Kills landfill, which means that it was a closed facility. They had to reopen it, and then they had to reclose it after it was done. In Hurricane Katrina, there was actually a lack of disposal, so that basically resulted with literally hundreds of temporary storage sites. And these are not small sites. I mean, these are a couple 100-acre staging sites, temporary sites. The other thing that should be done is, at least in your planning and as an LEA, the one thing that's very important with FEMA is you have to have documentation. You got to follow their guidelines if you want to get reimbursement. So if you're doing all this extra activity as a result of FEMA and it's actually described in your plan and you've accounted for it, and you can show the documentation, you actually get reimbursed. So that part's really important. So there's lots of times where you don't follow procedures or you do things that questionable. Was it required because resulting from this disaster? And then if you don't have the documentation or show that was part of an accepted plan, you're not going to get reimbursed. This is the recycling for 9/11. And this, like I said, this is mainly the steel. But because New York had a very comprehensive recycling plan and was actually required that the materials generated as a result of this disaster was to be recycled, the city actually got reimbursed for all their recycling efforts. Now for Hurricane Katrina, it was a little bit of a different story. When the recovery effort first started, there was really no FEMA reimbursement for recycling. The contracts that were being let by the Army Corps of Engineers to the private contractors that are doing the collection of the materials and the processing really did not have very much provisions for recycling. And if you did recycling, it was kind of on your own. The contracts for recycling were very limited. And it was complicated by the fact that because of the media, there was a lot of criticism of the local efforts and of the FEMA, so the political pressure was to do something even if you're not recycling, so it's just to collect everything as quick as possible. And again, it's not the state, they don't have an AB 939, although they do have kind of a recycling goal. So the other thing that kind of crops up with all these disasters is lots of opportunities for fraud. If you're not prepared for this, you can really feel the impacts of this. So, because these things, if you set up temporary landfills, you're not going to be able to set up scales. So you had trucks that basically hauled air and charged by volume. And in a disaster where there were multiple cities involved, one contractor did work for 2 cities and submitted, where they did work in one, they submitted bills to 2 cities. And the best one I heard was at a disposal facility, they were trying to see how much to reimburse the landfill for the space they had used up. So they basically estimated the volume of a pile. And this was a huge pile, but what they stacked up pretty high. So if you just kind of walked around and kind of got the perimeter, you could figure out the volume. But what they didn't count on was that the inside of this huge pile was actually hollow like a donut. So these things happen, so you just have to be prepared for it. So you take preventative measures, and very important for FEMA, for disaster preparedness, is get in-place contracts ahead of time and really have a good enforcement and monitoring program. Wayne Suda, the director of the City of LA LEA, to give you some of his perspectives.